Hi, my name is Dr. S.M. Rodriguez. I am the director of the LGBTQ Studies program at Hofstra University. On April 23rd, 2020, Hofstra University hosted its 7th LGBTQ Studies Symposium. However, for the first time, it was virtual. Co-sponsored by the Department of Sociology and Criminology program, the Center for Race, Culture, and Social Justice, Student Access Services, and the Hofstra Cultural Center, we heard 10 scholars, activists, and artists respond to the question posed by the symposium title, Deviant Past, Subversive Futures? The 3 panels were recorded and are offered here. Panel 1 was titled Queer Artistry, Performance, and Subjectivity. Panel 2, Decarcerating Disability, Abolishing Gender, and Decolonizing Our Future. Panel 3, Re-envisioning Care, Nurture, and Hope for a Queer Future.
Destinies that condemn trans people of color to death worlds. Under colonial domains, these predeterminations are necropolitical in nature and mark trans of color bodies, and especially Black and brown trans women and those perceived as such, as only deserving of early death, living while dead, or inhabiting other realms of death. Considering decoloniality as praxis, a necessity in trans of color liberation projects, my aim in this work is to highlight the ways discourses centering trans people of color tend to orbit around the perpetuality of death. I first noticed this trend while reflecting upon my own work's preoccupation with trans of color mortality. In decolonizing work, I relied so heavily on analyses of the necropolitical that concepts of the possibilities of life had escaped me. To affirm my observations, I conducted these general searches for the key terms Black transgender women, transgender of color, and their variations on Google and Google Scholar, set to my current region in the Northeast. So I did this because I wanted to conduct both general and scholarly searches on these platforms to confirm what I have noticed in both popular culture and in published journal articles. As these search engines have ostensibly become the default for most with internet access, my thinking is that search results might convey the content on trans of color ontology that is most easily accessed by the public. Not to my surprise, I found top searches in news, magazine, and nonprofit organization websites to have headings that almost always position trans women of color in high proximity to domestic violence, discrimination, the epidemic of death and murder, HIV and AIDS, and themes of crisis and risk. News publications in particular tend only to dehumanize subjects in the graphic recounting of attacks and deaths, and contribute to dominant narratives that define trans of color bodies as perpetually troubled, diseased victim, and always already condemned to a limited time on Earth. The top searches for academic articles did not differ much in that the pieces focused on discrimination, depression, homelessness, familial rejection, lack of access to services, mental and physical health issues, negative media portrayals, and again, we see these terms such as risk behavior and HIV risk. Scholars, though, did not just state the struggles of trans people of color, but managed to grasp at the possibilities of life worlds through notions of overcoming and resiliency. These publications on trans of color and markedly Black trans people uplift the value of our bodies, but oftentimes do so within or in direct relation to denouncing the culprits of our misery. We may conceptualize this journey as a politics of resurrection, which involves travel through realms of death to grasp at realms of life. Although I use this tactic often in my work, like when I explore the transversal nature of Black embodiment through the transatlantic slave trade to articulate Black consciousness as communally subsistent, I find it troublesome that the most common routes we take to bolster prospects of life are made accessible only through pathways of death. This constructs an essence of being encapsulated by proximity to struggle. My aim here is not to critique the foundational work scholars have contributed to trans of color studies, nor to question the reason behind studying the systemic condemnation of our bodies to realms of death. We study death because it is the real and the experienced. My uneasiness rather lies in the perception of trans of color existence as in a perpetual state of devastation, supported by the overwhelming prevalence of literature and public discourse discussing them in these contexts. While the sources I considered raised awareness about trans of color violence in order to uplift their worthiness of life, what may translate to subjects themselves is that they exist within a preconceived, predetermined, and inevitable order of things, in which their bodies and embodiments are only defined as in a mode of survival, with Black trans women in constant confrontation with the statistic that they will likely be murdered before age 35. This distancing of the death world as one of the only realms of possibility will make space to sway closer to radical imaginaries in which Black and brown trans lives do not exist solely in the domains of the dead or the living dead. However, this does not mean we abject the study of trans violence, necropolitics, and death worlds, as they are necessary to make sense of the ways in which coloniality shapes all domains of our existence. While I caution an approach to necropolitical analyses that help to eternalize trans of color subjectivity as in a perpetual state of suffering, I do believe to be rooted in knowledges of the violent lived realities of our people is imperative in projects of imagining worlds otherwise. In addition, we must remain intimately aware of the inevitability of the violent nature of radical refusal in the corporalization of our own destinies. This nuanced understanding will not only help to craft our responses to this threat of non-life, but also to transcend the essentialized ontology of persistence through struggle. In order to effectively generate alternate trans of color futurities, or at least to conceptualize the multiplicity of our options for futures, we must not only engage in the demolition of the colonial institutions that oppress us, such as the gender-sex binary, afterlives of slavery, white supremacy, and global westernization, but also transcend survivability in our task of beginning anew. This involves a radical imagination that assists in the manifestation of worlds of possibility. Imagination and subsequent manifestation of these future life worlds require the doer to embody states of consciousness that embrace intangibilities, metaphysicalities, subdued potentialities of knowing and being, and the notion that multiple, malleable, permeable realities alternative to the one in which we consciously live do not exist that far from the realm of possibility. Transformative justice, mutual aid networks, and FTP, which may stand for Fuck the Police, Fuck the Prisons, and or Free the People, coalitions are examples of world-making practices that cultivate other ways of living and doing ungoverned by coloniality. Transformative justice initiatives, for example, establish alternatives to state-sanctioned intervention in cases where someone has been harmed or has done harm in one's community. This no-nonsense anti-state approach proposes an alternative way of resolving conflict through healing practices, away from the state's default response, which is to mark deviant and incarcerate. Mutual aid networks also abject reliance on the government for community well-being. Especially as the COVID-19 pandemic continues, community members and activist groups have offered assistance with tasks and free deliveries for those who are unable to do the labor themselves. Instead of government channels, word is spread through flyers on sidewalks and inside apartment buildings, posts online, and word of mouth. Taking the well-being of one's local community into the hands of the collective symbolizes a radically imaginative act in which people of a shared socio-geographic location together craft these matrices of care, in which racial capitalism does not drive the performance of services for other people. FTP coalitions also radically imagine other planes of existence away from the normative order of prisons, police, and the commodification of the basic necessities of life like public transit. In the same frame, I want to prioritize the creation of potentialities that reach far beyond comprehension within a white Western state of consciousness. At the very least, this challenges us to unsettle the intimate relationship we have with the coloniality responsible for what we are told is real, as opposed to the imaginary and therefore unattainable. In making these Black and brown trans worlds anew, I caution against the involvement of those who have conjured, deployed, or severely benefited from bio and necropolitical, techno-industrial, excavatory modernities that mark trans of color lives disposable. In a similar sense, in his book, The Black Radical Imagination, Robin D.G. Kelley emphasizes he is interested in Black people's ideas of new and alternate worlds in particular, and not the construction of Black communities whose regional, social, and ideological domains are governed by white liberal capitalist values. Like Kelley, I am hesitant to enlist white people with the task of imagining new worlds, as they may too easily reconstitute new forms of modernity, or another new world, capital N, capital W. Thinking more about my hesitation to enlist whites in this decolonial task, I look to the tangible spaces where white Western queers have imagined and institutionalized their new worlds outside of cis heteropatriarchy and homo-nationalism. Here, I am referencing the ways in which white queers, who oftentimes have access to social and monetary capital, establish event spaces, organizations, media presences, and corporations that usually end up perpetuating damaging colonial rhetoric. Although the shift from binary gay to an increase in queer and trans-friendly spaces appears to translate to notions of progress, these progressive acts are surface-level attempts at diversity that divert our attention from the seat coloniality always has at the table. Unlike white queers' exertion of modernity, trans people of color's familiarity with the violent repercussions of racism, sexism, queerphobia, and more equip us with a double or multi-consciousness that aids in imagining new worlds that can transcend the coloniality of being, knowledge, and power. The fact is, though, any person who lives in a society constituted by colonial standards of normality, colonized and colonizer alike, are susceptible to reconstituting new forms of modernity. In radically imagining these alternate worlds, we must also acknowledge that performances of and orientations to colonialist ontology and knowledge systems exert modernity in different ways, in different places and spaces. Ultimately, to approach decolonizing trans of color futures involves both grounding our knowledges in necropolitical realities and the potentialities of pluriversal worlds. Trans of color consciousness in this sense serves as a locus point through which to comprehend possibilities, to transcend colonial regulations, locate subdued imaginaries, and to embark on re-existent futures. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kai. So it's actually a great, well, you'll see the connections, and we'll talk about these connections soon. So let me put on my
connections.
Let's see. Somehow I have managed to lose my talk. Okay, so my talk is called The Queer Politics of Women's Encagement and Mislabeling in Prisons. And I want to offer, I guess, a few content warnings ahead of time, because toward the end of the talk, I will be talking about miscarriage and death and referencing a few things that happened in this particular case that I'm discussing here. So I'm looking specifically at a book that was recently published called No Roses from My Mouth, Poems from Prison, that was published by Stony. So in No Roses from My Mouth, Stony, a recently released political prisoner in Kampala, Uganda, pens 158 poems from Luzira Women's Prison. The feminist warrior's diatribe takes the form of largely unedited, unpretentious protest odes. In it, she offers 3 volumes, each broken into 3 parts, each part 1 relating to life in prison, each part 2 relating to feminism, and each part 3 about Uganda. Despite this provided organization, the interwoven messages of Nyansi's thoughts prevail, as can be seen in the brilliant poem Weaver of Mats, which was a poem that exposes the exploitation of women's prison labor in Uganda, undoubtedly a feminist, anti-carceral, and Ugandan issue. In a review that I recently published with The Conversation Africa last month, I focused on 2 of 5 major themes that I identified in the book. The review proposed alternative foci, first looking into Nyansi's patriotic or revolutionary motherhood. The second, looking at Nyansi's portrayal of criminalization as the perverse upward distribution of women's labor and an unjust focus on locking up the poor and the nuisance. This talk will focus on the queer gender and sexual politic presented, and how Nyansi's poetic account demonstrates greater faults of carceralism, particularly in its existence as a tool to consign certain bodies to early deaths, which is the very definition of racism offered by Ruth Wilson Gilmore, or necropolitics by Achille Mbembe. So first, it's really important to situate the prison in Uganda, as well as the currently understood binary gender scheme, as colonial inventions. The land that as well as Uganda itself, to be honest. The land that Luzira Women's Prison sits on is within the Kingdom of Buganda, which is a kingdom that exists today and should be acknowledged even within our contemporary understanding of the nation state, Uganda, that was established by merging this kingdom with roughly 13 other kingdoms and chiefdoms. Penal institutions in Uganda began that year, or began the year that it was established as a protectorate, Reed Colony, of the United Kingdom in 1894. This timing reflects the global exportation of prisonization, which of course was carried by Western coloniality in the 19th century. Luzira is the only maximum security prison in the country, and it is where Stella Nyansi survived after a series of arrests for cyber harassment of the president and first lady by referring to President Museveni, the Ugandan president, as a pair of buttocks in a poem that she wrote in 2017. In her time, she wrote and smuggled out these fugitive poems, which will forever serve the Ugandan queer archive. Here's an excerpt from A Dark Kiss, which is a poem in the 3rd volume, written last December 2019, in the 2nd sectionism on feminism. Excerpt. I saw you kissing desperately. When the electricity blacked out, 2 lonely prisoners locked up for years in Ward 2. seated close to each other, sitting on the cold prison floor, chatting about this and that, yearning, desiring, longing, missing a lover's touch, missing tenderness, heterosexual on the outside, lesbian on the inside, lesbian tonight. In volume 2, part 2, also a section that's dedicated to feminist issues, is Sappho Opportunities. Meet me in the bathroom when inmates are watching favorite soaps, the bathroom bulb blue. We can soap each other's bodies, rub our bodies together, and finger long forgotten pathways. This time around, I'll be gentle with your nipples. Meet me in the chicken house when inmates are attending fellowship prayers. The coffee husks on the floor are fresh. We can lie on their cushion. Make love like two rabbits. Our moans will be drowned by the clucks. This time is your turn to look out for snitches and peeping toms. Meet me at the back of the classrooms when inmates meet for school parade. The guard posted their dozes. We can stealthily tiptoe past her. I will kiss your imprisoned lips and rain will fall from your fountain. Stolen kisses between women prisoners make us human, not immoral. These poems reveal the queer side of the prison, queer not as in identity, but as in a relentless desire to survive and grasp on to intimacy and wholeness, even if, or maybe especially if, it defies the norm for the individual or the society. When Uganda and lesbian are written together, it's almost never by those who experience and express the transcendent potential of queerness in that context. If it were, it would read like this: sensual, effervescent, human. Instead, it's almost always written from a white gaze, which eyes new legislation without eyeing history, which condemns an abstract oppression without condemning the institutions, the very institutions, those of policing and of imprisonment, built to oppress and sustained by the very colonial government superficially condemning anti-gay politics today. These poems offer a very real place. Within that place, we find the workspace of the people channeled into a carceral site in order to farm for the state, hence reference to the chicken house in the poem, or in the poem, The OC Has Cows. Although most of her language is garish, she embraces what's called a radical rudeness in protest of the state. It's within the subtlety that Nyansi best shows us how the criminal legal system has formed in order to sequester and exploit those in positions that the state imagines as unproductive. The poor, the political dissenter, and the minority are corralled into these spaces and forced into productivity through the creation of sellable goods or into political, social, and physical death. Nyansi explores all of these examples in her musings. What is perverse is not the sexual or intimate desire that women experience in their desperate seeking of human connection, but the fact that humanity is stripped from them by those in power who were sanctioned by the state to enact immoral and unreasonable harm on others. As we can see in poems titled Murder Convicts Lead Us or Beautiful Nana. Or actually, there's a poem that's called Prison is a Fuck. Pardon anyone's French. You can see that parallel made most explicitly. We see this universal truth of prisons examined through a Ugandan lens, where people with so much to offer are entrapped, degraded, and used to create products from which they cannot themselves benefit. They're left to deal with the full-scale degradation of the maximum security prison, where health provisions and food become currencies that arise from the context of total deprivation. Poems that show this are titled Menstrual Pads Are Currency, or Two Mandazis Only. The women encaged rely on each other for everything from sanitary napkins to pest control to firewood to entertainment to intimacy. I want to turn to this poem called Intersex in Prison to reflect on the institutional confusion of gender. This is excerpted as well. So for the full one, I'm just going to go ahead and say you have to buy this book. It's available as ebook. It's fantastic. So she says, "You, my friend, confuse their brains. You walk like a man with swagger, but reside in a woman's prison. You flirt harder than most men I know, but bear your shame like a first wife. You cut your hair like a man, but you groom your fingernails like a woman. Your family wronged you with that surgery. You smile when I call you my son, a child born with both a penis and vulva. Your intersexuality mesmerizes me. A man, a woman, a fabulous person, how you confuse gender rigidities. Your intersexuality confounds certainties, ends up confusing the gender lines in prison. This institution cannot understand you. You are intersex in prison." I want to argue that the mislabeling of womanhood and its various supposed accompaniments is actually a greater plot than the specific point that the institution cannot understand her intersex prison mate. It becomes obvious that the intersection, that the institution doesn't understand, read, know how to manage or treat humanely anyone, as even she is mislabeled postmenopausal rather than sexual or reproductive. In light of the distribution or lack thereof of resources to prisoners, those inherently imagined as disposable by the state, Dr. Niansi experienced both the blockage of antenatal care and the lack of sanitary pads due to this mislabeling. If reproductive capacity is imagined as so central to womanhood, then the institution couldn't understand her gender either. This mislabeling actually led to death in January 2019. Her grief on vivid display through her words, we witness her miscarriage of justice, which is the unborn child that she lost on the prison floor between the protective coverings of other prisoners who forged shields from blankets and scraps of toilet paper. She laments that her dead child was roughly disposed of along with biohazardous medical refuse interspersed with syringes, gloves, and cotton wool. She cuts off her dreadlocks to pay her respects, quite literally left with discharging pieces of herself, because what remains when all else is taken? The act symbolizes the carceral abuse that deprives the life of generations of Africans around the world. This connection she actually calls to in several poems, and I think is particularly striking because her words are very reminiscent of other women who were political prisoners, including Assata Shakur and some of the poetry that she wrote in her book. It's other prisoners who were able to mourn with her and that she mourns with in many other accounts of death throughout the book. Their collective power is made evident by their survival, and a queer intimacy is created by that survival. Niansi's writing reflects Audre Lorde's words in A Litany for Survival, where Audre Lorde says, "And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we're still afraid. So it's better to speak remembering we were never meant to survive." No Roses from My Mouth, taken as a whole, I think offers a really devastating, but hopeful, but rich, provocative, and ultimately queer account of prisons, with particular focus on gender, poverty, the inherent corruption of criminalization, and the ultimate subversion performed by prisoners, which is triumph through collectivity, comradeship, and survival through togetherness. I'll close out from there, and I think toward the end we'll be able to maybe talk through some of these parallels. Thank you. And Marquis, you will be up.
Okay, hello everyone. So I just want to thank SM for the invitation and also my co-panelists for their brilliance, really. So I'm just going to dive right in. So my talk today is titled Black Trans Ether Toward a Kind of Gender Abolition. And it draws from two book projects, the one on Black trans feminism, currently under contract, and another on the relationship between Blackness and the category of cisgender, which is in the final stages of being written. Section 1. I'm not sure I am, or if I must be, want to be any particular gender. They tell me with clarity and verve, with the coercive function and lexical of feminists old and misogynists new and old, that I and all of us must be and are men and women. To deem ourselves otherwise is an injustice. To deem ourselves otherwise is naive and attempted absolution. It seems to me and those with whom I am in intellectual and socio-political coalition that the notion of identity is the project of a philosophical tradition invested in ownership, in exclusion, in immutability, and its tethers to fixing knowledge, not to mention cis-normative white supremacist heteropatriarchy, or you are this thing that we tell you you are, a thing in hierarchical relation, a thing in mutually exclusionary relation. Identity, in the way we often understand and champion it, is the result of a carceral project of individuation, the name for individuation's nominalization. To the extent that identity disallows coalition in engendering precisely the kind of radical world to which we call out, is the extent to which we must forsake the identificatory project. Such a project prohibits abolitionary strivings on the ground that identity is the subjective instantiation, the coercively bestowed coveted possession of the onto-epistemic project toward which abolition stands as antithetical. The Black and trans of this matter cannot abide such classificatory violences, so it urges us to abolish too the categories we may love even if they have not always been received well. If the aim of the radical project of Blackness and transness is abolition, it is imperative to grapple with what that actually means. We cannot half-ass abolition, holding on to some of the things we didn't think we would be called out for needing to give up. The project at hand is interested in a thoroughgoing conception of freeness, and it seems like abolition, to call on Saidiya Hartman, quote, makes everyone freer than they actually want to be, unquote. We are not to capitulate to a sort of abolished world because some people who may look like us or the people who have been forged in oppression are pleading to us. We still, even when grandma doesn't think she wants it, work to abolish the world. This is what abolition as an orientation toward radical freedom commits to. And that will not be easy, nor will it feel good in the ways that we expect. If this talk is titled Black Trans Ether, it is because I am thinking Blackness as para-ontologically distinct from Black people, drawing on Fred Moten, Naomi Chandler, and J. Cameron Carter, which makes Blackness a penchant in disposition and irreverent relation to categorization and captivity. As mutinous relation to imposed ontology, Blackness enables and conditions the inhabited spirit of subjective abolition, the eradication of a fundamental axis of the self. Transness, in turn, always shadowed by its echolalic Blackness, unfixes gender from essentialist moorings and posits itself precisely as that unfixation, as a departure from, without the presumption of a stable destination, or indeed a departure that itself destabilizes destinational desires. This transness is endemic to a genealogy that has at its foundation the fundamental critique of the capaciousness of man and woman, and as such, the critique of the regulative regime of normative gender and categorization, which is to say, gender as such. Black and trans reference movement and cultivate space to live, to become as being in this movement. It becomes necessary that we retool the language of approaching gender and its abolition, an abolition that is concerned much more with the creation and cultivation of a new way to exist than with incessantly referencing and the purportedly bad iteration of gender, e.g. toxic masculinity. Abolition means just that, and Black and trans ether stands here for gender abolition, even in the face of those who would, as they say, feel some type of way about gender abolition after they worked so tirelessly to gain recognition or validity in their own, often historically marginalized gender. Black and trans ether must respond to the expected question, even my gender, even progressive masculinities and innocent femininities, with an understanding but assured yes. And it is in service of racialized and gender justice because gender abolition gratuitously expands the ambit through which subjects might become subjects in ways that do not carry with them the normativities of worlds and histories past. which then means we will have the possibility to become something or some things that have never been permitted to arise. And we would not have gotten to these things if we did not unequivocally, searingly refuse the coerced regime of gender we had no choice but to exist as. When we refuse this, we make possible the very thing the regime sought to preemptively and post hoc quell. Section 2. I want to belong somewhere, Mackenzie Wark says in a trans gesture that reckons with how her transness necessitates the obliteration of what has become the being onto which her transness is cast. But I don't want an identity, she concludes. The very notion of identity is a philosophical project that has held sovereign sway over how we've understood what is possible for us. There is an obsession with how to pin down, how to get at the fundamental element, how to not have to think about being something else at the heart of the Westphalian international order, this political and philosophical project of sovereignty. We can be without making recourse to the paltry scraps we've been given, like a bad flight offering only chicken or fish when we've been vegan for a while now. What would it be like to have food that sustains us, food we can eat, food that is not predicated on the slaughtering of others? Identity is an apparatus of legibilizing, of interpolating, requires that those for whom the identity is definitional only be in as much as they measure up to the identity and, most crucially, do not permit themselves to be other than the identity, which commits an atrocious monopolizing of how one can emerge as a subject. There is an immeasurable array of wondrous things I might have come into the world, which is not to say that my physiognomy is infinitely mutable, but that my physiognomy is always subject to being read, a reading that is vastly contingent on what is discursively and historically permissible, which claims the very meaning, the very contour of me as existing. To be given an identity, which is always the causal relation where we are thrown into a terrain we are forced to struggle with, is to be disallowed from the jump, the other things in the array of possibilities. It is because identity is invoked as an immutable possession, what we simply are, obscuring its construction. So I promote to abolition as of one of the vectors of identity, gender, or at the very least something like gender abolition, which is to say, quote, it's an abolition of sovereignty. It's an abolition of a certain horrible and brutal individuated notion of freedom. And it's an abolition of the world that is constructed on that conceptual framework, unquote, as Fred Moten writes. It may not be about erecting something at all. It may be much more fruitful and interesting to think of how we can come to something like gender abolition through something, how we might come to something like gender through something like gender abolition, through, as it were, a project not of putting things together, but of viewing with soft eyes, feeling with humbled breath the gloriousness of how things fall apart. And the shards lying there is a mosaic of pieces you can pick up and carry with you, fondling it in your hands, tucking it in your pocket, only to discard it later. Or you can stomp on the shards, grinding them into smaller pieces, awing at their disintegration. Or further still, you can step over the pile, walking into the sunset. Section 3. There are objections, of course. There are those who have castigated gender abolition as a super white fantasy inattentive to the effects of racialization on gender, and indeed the love, say, a Black woman might have of her gender. How dare the gender abolitionists say that we should abolish gender from the Black woman on the assumption that they are cisgender and have the capacity to house a fetus, finally begins to understand the gifts of her capacity as more than a damnation to birthing chattel. How dare the gender abolitionists say that we should abolish gender when there are Black women loving Black women primarily on the ground that they are Black women? And these, I assure you, are quite serious accusations, accusations that cannot and must not be waved off as uninformed. These accusations require that we tarry with the discomfiture they lay bare. Where some tout the alternative of a more humble gender democratization, others tout gender abolition as colonization. As many of those who advocate for gender abolition are white, there is the thought that because of this, the conceptual framework propelling it is an extension of colonization efforts to proliferate whiteness. To say that gender is socially constructed is to deprive it of its staying power, but a power that is historically variable in its constancy. We societally have placed importance in gender, not given it have given it a category, have held it dear to us over centuries. If we then go out evangelizing the abolition of gender, we're intervening in worlds and cultures we ought not to, and spreading the doctrine of a troublesome creed. Writes Lola Phoenix in a piece titled Gender Abolition as Colonization, quote, "The problem with abolishing gender is that not only do we have to define it, apply our definition toward other cultures, demand they remove gender from their own race, cultural, spiritual, or whatever background, but also assume that the abolition of the concept of gender will result in equality or a lack of discrimination. In doing so, from a white perspective, we effectively create a colonizing project wherein we're intervening in their own identities, behaviors, and practices in an attempt to make their lives better," unquote. Contra gender abolition, everyone's gender is okay as long as it doesn't hurt anyone. Everyone's gender is valid. Everyone's understanding of their gender is totally okay because it's their lived experience. And all of this at some point in my life seemed pristinely sensible. I need to push back on this prevailing discourse in the circles I traverse only because there is sedimenting within them a troubling liberalism manifesting as incessant uncriticality. Such a pervasive liberalism, which is not to say radicalism or leftism, quote, is mostly just an appeal to maintain the status quo, since hurting others gets defined as doing anything that upsets the privileged class, unquote, a manner of engagement that cannot make sense of the kind of trans radicalism someone like Kai Cheng Tom, from whom I take this quote, yearns to gift us with. The sentiment is often that the categories, whatever they are always good because you say your experience has been such that you have a sense of yourself thanks to gender. Don't you dare take that away from me. But I must depart. This is not a mainstream feminist project where what is striven for is equality of the sexes, nor is this a project that simply attempts to liberate women from men. I would wager that what I am slowly articulating on vibratory decibels is in fact something like gender abolition, a formulation not beholden to a definitive account of what gender abolition is. It is a provisional yet no less radically committed endeavor to inflect gender abolition, to signal it without pinning it down, for in its abolitionary ethereal bones is an anti-categoricality, A-N-T-E, that refuses even its own nominative. That I am looking for language to characterize something like gender abolition attests to a lack of interest in trying to define the world or mandate how the world should be. It is such that it cannot promote the world's categorization. Also, it cannot promote a relativism that permits any and all categorizations simply for the sake of remaining pure. There can still be belonging, ethics, and the upholding of an ethics of non-violation. And it is in the pursuit of the anti-categorical where this might happen. The abolition of concern here, for me, is an anarchic refusal of the system and all its placating offerings, inclusions, rights, finances, whatever it must in order to preserve itself, to remove itself from scrutiny. We cannot be seduced, as difficult as it very well is, by the many iterations of better. Quote, "We need an imagination that overreaches immediate issues of safety, rights, and health, not because these things don't matter, but rather because formal rights and structured oppression can happily coexist. Regimes of neoliberal democracies have increasingly sought to absorb the claims of oppressed people into a more effective tool of domination. We should be deeply skeptical of placing value in the acquisition of formal rights when they are used to incorporate people in the legitimation of a violent border regime. The fact that feminism and LGBT rights are used as ideological lubrication for imperialism and colonialism, aided and abetted by the calcified remnants of social movements, does not end oppression, but successfully refashions it," unquote. And that is a quote from Solveig Gore's essay subtitled "Toward a Cyborg Transfeminism." Seeking more rights is not abolition. Seeking inclusion and fairness within the system is not abolition. Seeking the reversal of the hierarchies is not abolition, and seeking individuality is not abolition. We are not to seek the reform of the system, as it is the system that orchestrated this mess. We seek, in no uncertain terms, abolition of the system. We have all this discourse on policing as deleterious to the well-being of our communities, and as radical abolitionists, we demand the end of policing. If we are to live this assertion to really be about that life, it is crucial to heed an ameliorative and abolitionist politics toward the ways that gender is policed, which is not merely to say that certain ways genders are derogated over or against others that are permitted sovereign sway, but more the ways gender itself functions as an extension and iteration of policing. The chance for no cops and no prisons includes the gender police and gender imprisonment too. And since gender is an imposition, a non-consensual required imposition, we are punished for not receiving on the terms of the imposition, which puts gender in the realm of the transitive verb to gender, gendering. Then something like gender abolition would just as readily urge an anti-gender disposition as it would urge, like many already do, an anti-racist and anti-capitalist disposition. It is easy enough to see that the binary and perinatal assignations are impositions, non-consensually given identities that work overwhelmingly to the harm of oneself and others, in as much as such as that violation is the trauma through which one is permitted to exist in the world. So ask me not who I am, what my gender is, and ask me not to verify others. That is the work of the police. And if we are to aspire toward police abolition, toward no new or old jails, it seems to me we are required to take our claims to their end, the abolition, or something like it, of gender. This livable wreckage is where, in a Foucauldian sense, quote, it's not the assertion of identity that's important, unquote. It is where, in Black trans scholar Doris Silva Santana's sense, we are constituted by, quote, a movement of liberation against gendered racialized oppression. It is moving across and along the waters, the imposed limits of gender, unquote. There is another way, or other ways, to live in this world that exhausts the arrangements in place. Thank you.
Powerful. Thank you so much. Liat.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Thank you so much. Please use this time to, if you want to take a break or use the Q&A function, because I feel that the 3 talks have been so generative already, and I don't want people to forget what they have to ask, because I'm going to move us into a little bit of a different direction. And also some of my work, I feel complements some of the stuff that was said, and some of it is very much in tension with some of what is said. And so I want to share a little bit of kind of an overview from the upcoming book, which, like SM said, will hopefully, pandemic willing, will materialize itself in a few weeks, perhaps a month or so. And I'm gonna try to share here. Sharing is caring. All right. All right. So can you see the slides? Okay, thank you. So my book, Decarcerating Disability, Deinstitutionalization, and Prison Abolition, talks about what we can learn from deinstitutionalization to aid us in understanding prison abolition, or to go towards prison abolition. It also talks about what it can aid us to have a disability analysis to understand abolition more generally, which I think is where my talk is in conversation with Marquis's talk, for example. So when we discuss mass incarceration and decarceration without referring to disability, it really ignores, it does 4 things. One is that ignores the varied locales in which incarceration happens. So incarceration doesn't just happen in prisons, it happens in a variety of facilities which are incredibly carceral, including psych facilities, for example, group homes, nursing homes, and so on. So I literally mean locations of incarceration. I also mean carceral logics, and I'll talk about that later. It also avoids an understanding of disability as an analytic category, and also disability as a way to view the world or a lived experience. So basically, how can we harness the knowledge of movements, MAD movements, self-advocacy movements, disability movements, in order to understand incarceration and decarceration? I'm going to try to talk about that the first 5 minutes of the talk. Yeah, 5 minutes. But a lot of it is in the book. But also a way to inform policy and activist resolutions to best social problems. So this talk and the book in general, I hope, is a kind of disability gain. So the book very much builds on a crip of color critique of incarceration, which comes, of course, from Rod Ferguson's work on queer of color critique. And so I'm combining here Kathy Cohen, Dean Spade, and others who really urge us to frame issues of criminalization and incarceration through queer of color critique that questions traditional white liberal approaches to these problems, such as calls requiring more legislation, inclusion, incorporation, but doing it within the system. And so queer of color critique very much is against, as you just heard from everybody who spoke, very much against that framework, and instead encourages to understand things through an intersectional lens that has a broader analysis of what we come to call freedom and what liberation might be. So following such frameworks, I want to ask, what is disability justice or queer of color critique of incarceration and decarceration would be? And this, of course, comes from crip theory, Requer, and crip of color, which is very much indebted to Gina Kim's work. A lot of it is unpublished yet. So I'm just going to give, I'm really going to give just one slide about deinstitutionalization, and I'm really sorry, but the whole book is about that. And I just want to say, because I want to focus for the rest of my talk about prison abolition in regards to crip of color critique. And I want to say, though, that abolition of prisons is, or other carceral enclosures, is not some kind of what people call utopian dream for the future, but it's something that has already happened. And it's not just happened, it happened in so a lot of the times that, you know, when you talk about prison abolition, the first thing that people say is, oh, we can't really do it, or we can't do it right now, or we can do it in places like Norway or something like that. And so what I want to say is, well, it happened already. It happened in this country, what we call, you know, the United States, this part of Turtle Island, in the form of deinstitutionalization in the field of mental health and what was then called mental retardation, or now IDD, and the massive closure of residential institutions and psych hospitals. So we did it already. We, at least in terms of decarceration, we already did that. So just for the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus on queer and crip of color critique of incarceration. And I just want to say, just as an overview, that prison is very disabling and very maddening. And there's a lot of examples for that. Closed wards with poor air quality, toxic conditions and materials, and you know, we can only think now about how COVID-19 is affecting people and how much disability and death it creates on people. There's no sanctioned access to sexuality or reproductive health care. As SM suggested, there's always access to sexuality, but no sanctioned access. Strip searches, of course, administrative segregation. These are all forms of violence, state violence against people, or what abolitionists feminists call basically prisons as state-sanctioned violence against women. Crip of color analysis of incarceration helps us in a variety of ways. I'm just going to suggest quickly 3. One is that if we think about disability studies, disability rights, disability justice, movements of people with disabilities and mad movements, and their critiques of rehabilitation, they critique rehabilitation as a form of normalization, as a form of assimilation. And some of it quite literally, meaning when you get sent to rehab, if you have substance abuse or if you have a disability, the point is to fix you, to make you into something else. So it's absolutely a form of assimilation and normalization. Rehabilitation, and this is from Luana Ross's work on Native women who are incarcerated. You know, it's really sprung as a form in the what we call United States and Canada as a form of colonial assimilation process. And so when I say rehabilitation and when I say corrections, I mean that quite strategically, meaning corrections is the desire to fix or correct people through medical, surgical, chemical treatments, through segregation, through incarceration. So corrections could be through the corrections industry, but also could be through the medical industrial complex. And the third thing is that both disability movements and prison abolition really critiques the way that we tend to individualize social issues. You know, we call it things like mental illness. We call it things like pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you know, all of those things. And instead, they want to focus on intersectional systemic analysis. So what are some collective responses instead of correcting or reforming individuals? Just I'm going to pause for a second. SM, I can't see what people say. So if somebody says something like slow down or something, just let me know verbally.
Will do.
Okay, thanks. In terms of my critique of what I'm calling this crip of color, critique of incarceration and decarceration is of course very much in conversation with and indebted to this concept of carceral feminism and then abolition feminism. So just for people who don't know, I know everybody on the call knows, but to give a definition, carceral feminism is the belief that the state and especially the criminal justice system can alleviate violence or abuse against women. And I'm saying women because that's literally what carceral feminism is. Although of course now there's, you know, more carceral feminism that's really embedded into the lives of trans people and queer people. But there's also a lot of turfers in there, so women. Okay, and what, of course, abolition feminists have been saying is that appeals to gender equality in corrections, from gender responsive prisons to hate crime legislation, leads only to the expanding of the carceral state, not the protection of women, women of color, trans people, queer people, gender non-conforming people, etc. And if people are interested in that particular claim, you should read Beth Ritchie's book, Arrested Justice. So anti-carceral feminists contest this approach by saying that prison is a form of violence against women, and of course, gender non-conforming and trans folks as well, and that such approaches end up expanding the scope of the carceral state. I think all of us know that. What I want to add to this conversation is this idea of carceral ableism or carceral saneism. And saneism, by the way, is the oppression that people with psychiatric disabilities or people with mental health differences face, and this kind of normative approach of you have to be normal. So carceral ableism and carceral saneism can show themselves within the creation of more hospital beds in prisons, the reform of psychiatric hospitals, the creation of more accessible mental health or mental health responsive prisons, or the construction of new jails that often don't even mention the word jail. And we've seen that kind of crop up in the last few years across the US, where a lot of jails are coming up with this idea that, oh, they're gonna help with substance use, or they're gonna quote unquote help, correct, treat, right? Things like mental health. And so we're starting to hear then this shift of the discourse from people, including abolitionists, that say things like, of course, people with various mental differences or disabilities or substance users, they need medical help and treatment, they don't need incarceration, right? And so this has been kind of the overarching campaigns that are going on. But what I want to say, and what I say in the book, is that we need to fight not only carceral expansion via prisons and jails, but also so-called treatment, and not just behind bars. So when I started the talk a million minutes ago, when I talked about how corrections and treatments are really what we should be fighting against, not for, I think we should really apply that in the abolition context as well. And so we need to center the experiences includes centering trauma effects. It also includes understanding alternatives to incarceration differently, and also analysis and praxis of abolition. So for the remainder of my time, which I think is about 5 minutes, yes?
8.
8, all right. So for the remainder of my time, I want to talk about how crip of color analysis can change our analysis and praxis, not just of incarceration, but of abolition as well. In one of the chapters from the book, which has come out as an article in Critical Criminology, no comment, is that, and I called it This Epistemology of Abolition. I talk about how we can learn from an abolition that already occurred, meaning deinstitutionalization, and the various threads of prison abolition, particularly those that are grounded in maroon knowledges, what we can learn from those two things about the ethics of abolition, and abolition as an epistemology, as a way of knowing. And so I want to kind of push in that work that abolition of carcerality is an ethic and it's an epistemology. And it produces particular forms of knowing, but also forms of unknowing. So for example, a lot of critics say, well, if everything, which is another thing I hear a lot, I think we all hear a lot when we do abolition, we do talks about abolition, well, so basically you're critiquing everything. Everything is a reform then. All the alternatives are bad. Everything you suggest is, can be co-opted by the state. So what do you offer as a solution then, right? I mean, I think we all heard that a lot. Well, I want to suggest that this question itself is rooted in the kind of epistemological assumption that are better off abandoned by abolitionists, much like what Marquis was saying, that this demand only makes sense if it's ingrained in a privileged positionality and not an intersectional subjugated knowledge or maroonage, as those already oppressed don't feel secure in the first place. So this idea of, well, what do you offer, as a solution, really comes from a particular kind of location within that question. And as Sarah Ahmed explains, this is really the work of the feminist killjoy, is to bring that approach to abolition. And so what I'm calling the dis-epistemology of abolition is that we need to not only understand abolition and know abolition, but also know what to abandon about it. So letting go of attachments to certainty. For example, what are the consequences of doing something or not doing something? I think as abolitionists, we don't actually know. And I think it's very kind of humbling practice and a collective practice, and we do a lot of trial and error together. I think that this idea of, well, we all know that it will get better after we empty the prisons or the world, we rid ourselves of carceral logics. I think there's something about that that's about this kind of connection to optimism that, of course, a lot of queer thought has completely taken down. As you can see in the It Gets Better campaign, for example, this idea that ultimately, of course, everything anything we will do will be better, I think is something that is still imbued in this kind of carceral logic. The idea that anyone can have a definitive pathway of how to get rid of carceral logics is really attached to the idea of knowing that needing to know. And again, that's a part of effective economies that maintain carceral logic. Don't talk about it until you have a solution, which is of course a very kind of masculine form of this example, and also assume that there's some kind of one answer to the question of what is to be done. Expertise, tell us, you tell us what to do and we'll do it. Also something we need to let go of. And this idea of clairvoyance, what would happen? So as Sarah Ahmed says, the very expectation of happiness might be what gives us a specific image of the future, and we are directed by the promise of happiness. So my argument is not to suggest that there is no possible answer to the question of what is to be done, but I want to suggest that there are perhaps infinite answers to this question. And in suggesting the perhaps infinite possibility abolition conjures up, I'm using the term perhaps very intentionally, following theorist Sarah Ahmed. The word happy originally meant having good hap or fortune, she says, to be lucky or fortunate. But in relation to the feminist killjoy, Ahmed suggests that in refusing to be constrained by happiness, we can open up other ways of being perhaps. So the word perhaps shares its hap with happiness. To deviate from the paths of happiness is to refuse to inherit the elimination of the hap. So basically moving us from happiness to perhaps. The goal of abolition is therefore not finality, but process. It's a movement. It's a movement not just as a social movement, but it's a movement in the way that it understands itself. Thomas Mathiasson says, the alternative lies in the unfinished, in the sketch, in what is not yet fully existing. Beth Ritchie talks in her book, Arrested Justice. She has an amazing chapter called How We Won the Mainstream But Lost the Movement. And so I want to kind of end here with suggesting that the movement is not just a social movement, but the actual kind of perpetual moving along that we do that is abolition, this kind of collective trial and error process. Avery Gordon suggests that abolition time is a type of revolutionary time, but rather than stop the world as if it's an absolute break between now and then, it's a daily part of it. And of course, this should conjure up Jose Muniz's approach to the here and now in relation to queer utopias and so on. So the sense of urgency enables abolitionism as utopian epistemology to become a queer model for political activity in the here and now, with a vision for the future, a vision of the perhaps. So just to end, Queer of Color Critique of Incarceration really shows that prison is maddening, prison is disabling, it's unfit for women and gender non-conforming people, it's unfit for youth, for women, for people with disabilities. They should not be placed in segregation or in prison, but should anyone. And this idea that if they shouldn't be in prison, they should be in treatment is also incredibly problematic. And so imprisonment and institutional segregation are really core structures that shape social relations in society, not just for those affected directly, meaning those who identify as, those who are politicized as, and so on and so on. And this is why we should care about them as queers, as disabled, as people of color. But it really affects everybody. This carceral logic affects everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liat, and all panelists for sharing. We have a number of questions that have come up in Q&A, and we have around 13 minutes to answer them. So I actually, well, I'll start. Hopefully this person is still with us. Anonymous attendee did mention that they are in Cape Town right now and it's getting very late. So I do hope that they're still around to hear this answer. Let's see. And so they're asking about a recording of these presentations. And yes, this is recorded. It will be available for you to watch, especially if you've missed anything or you want to review anything. The second part of that, though, was to say that they've thoroughly enjoyed all the talks. And they would like to find, if your paper is available, if anyone's papers are available today, if they could be made available publicly. And this one is particularly asking for Marquis's paper. Yeah, with great thanks to all from University of Cape Town. And there's an email address available there. So if you'd like to get in touch. Another also, Dennis specifically asked for Liat's presentation. And so I'll just say that we will make available papers or presentations of any panelist who feels comfortable doing that on the website after the event. But I do want to emphasize that many of the people who are speaking today and sharing are sharing from works that are available or going to be available, as books and otherwise very soon. So please stay in touch. I know that everyone is excited to continue sharing with attendees after this day. Okay, so to get to some of these questions, I'll try and group them like last panel. So Kai, there are 3 that are for you, so I'll just read these for you. To Kai, what thresholds are available to realize what is and isn't survivability, especially say in countries like where I am in India, but not limited to, where the colonial understanding of a sex or gender binary or sex or gender binaries are being pushed by legislation by a right-wing government that actively disenfranchises them? What infrastructure should already be in place for, quote unquote, a beyond survival? And what models of agency cut these thresholds? Then there is one that says, Kai, I love your talk and it's doing amazing work. I'm just wondering how you're framing decolonization and how it relates to Indigenous people's work and movement to building their own futurities. And the last one for Kai says, Kai's talk was brilliant. Could they share more about a beautiful term they used, quote, a politics of resurrection? What do you believe are the key elements or language to actively engage in that movement or way of being? Okay, so hold on to those for just 1 second and let me switch to Marquis. To turn Sadia Hartman around with apologies, are we bound to be subjects in ways that we do not consent to? If so, is the non-consensual not also a possibility for imagining otherwise? What I'm trying to ask is, if abolition in Blackness and transness is about movement, where can there be rest? Since I believe rest must be part of any freedom. For Liat, okay, there are a few. In the COVID climate, many of the, this seems like it's probably for everybody. In the COVID climate, many of those of us who hold identities in one or more marginalized group are witnessing what we can only label as the horrific revealing of our neighbors' inherent valuing of certain lives over others. Yes. Examples include an acceptance that many of those who are dying are, quote unquote, on their last leg anyways, are elderly, are severely disabled, are people of color, or are people whose behavior has led to their susceptibility. So we should not feel quite so bad about their loss. Do the panelists have opinions on whether a potential outcome of this virus will be a confirming of this institutional system, or that it will lead to progress in this regard and less of a tendency to measure quality of life or relative human value based on ableist, white supremacist, or patriarchal frameworks. Okay, then for Liat specifically, asking for your presentation, a PDF of your presentation, or at least a section on mass incarceration, which was rather informative. And to Liat, what is a perhaps model of organizing? Okay, thank you all for those questions, and I do hope we can get to those in the next few minutes. Good luck. Anyone who would like to go first?
I'll take a stab at it. So since there's a couple questions, I'll try to shorten it. But in terms of available thresholds, as I mentioned before, coloniality and modernity, they're these two sides of the same coin, and they play out differently depending on your social, cultural, geographic location. And so broadly, I'd say that survivability would be to exist or live life defined as always in the context of death. And so to reconceptualize oneself and one's collectivities around them, to transcend this would be the move. So to do this would be resisting the state through decoloniality. And so you need to question and evaluate all the ways that the legacies of colonialism are embedded in all domains of our existences. And so that is the advice that I would say for pursuing these futurities outside of a North American context. Locality and collectivity. This kind of goes into what I define decolonization as. So decolonization, quite literally for me, includes burning down all infrastructures, metaphorical or physical, and then you build anew. But the problem with that is that you need the collective to do so, and we can never achieve that if the collective doesn't want to do it. So I can't tell you what futurities to aim for, because that's the job of the locality. Also, burning it down and build anew is like kind of my catchphrase, so I think that's funny that you would ask. And so it's the long process of obliteration of all ways of knowing and being that are rooted in legacies of colonialism. And what I've learned from Indigenous scholars are so much. I usually mention indigeneity when I speak about these things and the relationships between Blackness and indigeneity, but I just didn't have that much time. But they've taught me these terms such as radical refusal and re-existence. And re-existence as the constitution of new worlds, away from what coloniality tells you is the normative, right, civil way of doing, being, knowing, living. That's where I get a lot of my inspiration and understanding of Black trans lives beyond survivability. And what they're radically refusing is the loss of land and colonial epistemologies. So I, a couple months ago, went to a Decolonize This Place, it's an organization, rally, and one of the speakers just told all the settlers to leave and get off the land. And that's what that means to me. It's a radical refusal. Okay, and then politics of resurrection. So I will admit that I recently came up with this term, so it's not super developed, but I was alluding to the ways in which we wait until after death to attempt to resurrect the worthiness of Black trans life. It's a method of finding life worlds, but like through understandings of experiences of violence. And so ways to engage in this would be divulging into the ontological states of those who have experienced hardship, and then connecting it to the modernities of present day, how it shows up in you today. And I think that's about it. So thank you. Those were great questions.
I can go next. I'll try to keep my response brief. So there were two parts to the question for me. The first one, in terms of, is there a way to kind of utilize the non-consensual in order for kind of otherwise possibilities? I would say absolutely. And I'm drawing on two people for that. One, Fred Moten, who, and I believe it's The Universal Machine, in which he remarks that there are resources working through the epidermalization via Blackness that work toward the anti-epidermalization towards his radical alternative, I think is his exact phrasing in that. So I'm drawing on that for one kind of thinking of this. And then another way I'm thinking about this is via Hortense Spillers. And in the conversation she has on her iconic essay, she remarks that the goal or the aim is to go through gender in order to get to something wider. And that something wider is the thing that I am incredibly interested in. So we have to go through these various kinds of non-consensual impositions that then allow us to get to something in the last instance that is much broader, much more expansive, perhaps even abolitionary than those identificatory projects. So that's the first question. The second one, in terms of, what was it? In terms of, rest, yeah. I never really have a good answer to this, and I need one because it's a very, very important question. And I think an initial response I have in terms of where we might find rest is in coalition, I think. And this is a coalition understood in the vein of someone like Kathy Cohen, and SM kind of alluded to Kathy Cohen in their talk. And this is a queerness that is not predicated on a specific possessed kind of identity or specific kind of sexuality, but rather is a subversive oppositional relation to power. It's very much about how we relate to politics or how we do politics. That is the predicate for the coalition. And that's how I'm understanding coalition. And so I can find rest, I think, in coalition via not having to navigate the various kinds of violences that betide us in the broader world. Coalition provides a space or not even a reprieve, but rather a way to exist to others that are not predicated on hegemonic normative ontological grounds. So in that coalition, we find a way to be encountered that is not preconditioning or circumscribing how we might show up, how we might exist in the world. That, I think, is where we might find a reprieve when we don't have to navigate or insert ourselves into these various kinds of discourses and templates, etc. That's where we find rest. And it's maybe temporary, but that temporary rest, that temporary reprieve, I think allows us to continue to do the radical abolitionist insurrectionary work that I think we're called to do. Yeah.
So I think Marquis just answered the question about the perhaps model of organizing. Thank you. Because I really think that that's what it's about. And, you know, another example would be what SM, you know, talked about within the poems themselves, but also SM, your interpretation or interpolation, like of the poems themselves, both in relation to the state, but also in relation to just kind of what we conceive and sometimes don't as queer organizing. So I don't have like a better answer than that. You know, another example in the deinstitutionalization context was when psych facilities, and especially in residential institutions for people with intellectual disabilities, when people fought to abolish them, there were not alternatives already in place. Right, so this idea that, you know, we need to have everything in form or already formed, or we already know, or there's already, you know, in order to do the thing, really history shows us that that's not how this works. This is not how kind of massive radical social change happens, and I see deinstitutionalization as that. And I just want to answer about the COVID question really quick. I know we have to wrap up, but I do think, you know, like I'm in my apartment. I mean, actually in my bedroom, very queer moment. And I think that this is not like a normal conference. I think the COVID moment is a moment that we need to reflect on. I don't think that we know exactly what, and I don't think we should, as I said just now, kind of reflect on exactly what it would mean for the future. But I do think that these networks of mutual aids that are popping up, and even just this conference, for example, are forms that people in the kind of disability world, for example, have been pushing for a really long time. This kind of more not just organizing, within ourselves, which is already what is happening in disability and communities and communities of color and so on, but also to make things online, for example, to allow various modes of participation. And if we can incorporate that in our organizing and activism, I think that would be also really awesome. So that's my hope for the COVID, at least that we don't forget this moment. That this kind of stays with us.
Yeah, I think that, take that off, that's awkward. I think that Marquis added something within their talk that I think might help us think about this moment, where they said that formal rights and oppression happily coexist in a moment, right? And so as a critique of liberal narratives of progress, I think that we can hold on to that even while we're talking about this kind of what's happening within the situation of COVID, in that we're experiencing so much institutional oppression. We're experiencing a lot of upward distribution of funds, in seeing how these bailouts are playing out in the country. We are hearing, I think, I've definitely, Julie, I appreciate this question because I have thought about this and kind of grieved a lot when I hear about, the way that disposability is playing out in some of our neighbors' imaginations of, well, yeah, I'm glad that, or, I think recently with the conversation about Florida's beaches reopening, people were like, great, that'll weed out, they actually use a very sanest term, and the idea that it's perfectly fine for people to die en masse because of, seeking the fresh air and the beach is something that's playing out in so many people's imaginations, and it's so incredibly harmful. And so simultaneous to our kind of witnessing of these systemic utterances, we are also, of course, experiencing mutual aid, kind of becoming a conversation within different communities. We are seeing, becoming a conversation in communities that weren't previously having that conversation, right? And so seeing ways that transformative or anarchic manifestations, groupings, collectives, etc., are doing this work is happening at the same time of, this moment of really intense oppression in our economic sphere in the country, but also culturally. And so what I think is really interesting, the connection that I wanted to make to what Marquis had said, was that one thing that we know is not coming out of this moment is any form of abolition. We can experience progress and we can experience change that might be really heartening in some ways, in the ways that communities are taking care of each other and how maybe some of these efforts are proliferating. And yet that is going to quite happily coexist with the really intense bailouts that are happening of the mega rich, and the ableist and classist frameworks that people are working within to kind of re-inscribe the disposability of certain bodies in our culture, in our society. There was a question for me, and I just, only because this is coming from someone who is in India, I want to make sure if we don't connect again that I'm able to address it. And so I apologize for missing that beforehand. It's kind of awkward to moderate and be a panelist. But they said, would we want to think about, quote unquote, kisses make us human, and Nyansi's relentless speaking up as on the same side of things, the function of a full mouth, rude and tender, the refusal of one thingness, man, woman, or intersex. I'm wondering if we might want to think about carcerality as the making of one function of things. Say sex for reproduction, woman as ... and so on. And I think, I'm just gonna say really briefly, because I do think that this developed later on in the panel, that of course I am imagining gender as serving really carceral functions, you know, collapse of identity, collapse of being able to express oneself or really imagine oneself as free of these kind of colonial dimensions. But at the same time, it's carceral in the more traditional sense of, you know, witnessing or experiencing surveillance, intense punishment, corrections, as Liat brings into her presentation, through forced assimilation and normativization, right? So this idea that you can't express or really even imagine oneself in an expansive way outside of these institutions, and then the way that we are constantly oppressed or forced into a very bounded sense of expression and being. So I will say yes, of course, I do want to think of carcerality in that way. And also, it sounds like you're a poet. Please keep writing, because that was beautiful. That was a great question. Thank you all for coming. And thank you all to the panelists for being a part of this really amazing conversation. I'm so honored to have you all here. For those of you who are staying on with us, we will meet for 4:30 for the panel number 3, which is on re-envisioning care, nurture, and hope for a queer future. Thank you again, Marquis, Kai, and Liat. And I'll make sure to pass these questions to you all. If I'm pretty sure you can see them, but you know, if you want to make these connections. Thank you all again.
Thank you.